Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing Cys-Loop receptors. Okay, right. So we're currently in the process of discussing GABA A receptors. Okay, and specifically we're looking at clinical correlates of GABA A receptors. So we've just been discussing the benzodiazepine drugs, okay, which are used to treat acute episodes of anxiety and insomnia. Okay, now they can't be used to treat anxiety and insomnia long term because they lead to tolerance and dependence. Okay, right. So what I now want to move on to discussing is a form of heritable epilepsy, okay, which is triggered by a germline mutation in one of the subunits for GABA A receptors. Okay, specifically it's triggered by a germline mutation in the gamma 2 subunit for GABA A receptors. Okay, so we have discussed that the main type of GABA A receptor that you have in the brain is of this alpha beta gamma form, okay, where you select one alpha subunit of a GABA A receptor and put it in these two slots in blue here, one beta subunit of GABA A receptor and put it in these two green slots here. Okay, and then you select a gamma subunit of GABA A receptors and stick it in this slot here. Okay, and we've discussed that these three major examples of GABA A receptors that are actually used in GABAergic neurotransmission within the brain all have this gamma 2 subunit as the GABA A receptor gamma subunit in this alpha beta gamma GABA A receptor. Okay, right. So now what I want to discuss then is this form of heritable epilepsy, which is generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures. Okay, so the first thing that I should say about generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus, I'm sorry, I previously missed out the plus there, okay, GEFS plus is its abbreviation, is that it can be caused by many other things besides mutations in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit. Okay, there are other mutations in other proteins that can also cause GEFS plus. Okay, so it's not solely due to a mutation in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit. However, a mutation in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit can lead to GEFS plus. Okay, so let's just go over what this stands for in full. Okay, so the GE then is for generalized epilepsy. Okay, so generalized is the G, and then epilepsy is the E. Okay, and then it's with febrile seizures, and don't worry, I will explain exactly what a febrile seizure is. Okay, and it's with febrile seizures plus, and I'll explain what the plus means later on. Okay, right. So before we go any further, what I want to do is just discuss some terminology for epilepsy, basically. So I want to discuss what epilepsy actually is, I want to discuss what a seizure is, and I want to discuss specifically what the difference between a seizure and a convulsion is, because often seizures and convulsions are used as interchangeable terms. However, they're not interchangeable. They do mean different things, okay? And it is important to understand what the difference between a seizure and a convulsion is. Okay, so let's start off with what a seizure is, because that's the centre of this all. Okay, right. So basically a seizure is often, in a one-line description, described as a storm of electrical activity within the brain. Okay, now what does that actually mean? Well, normally in the brain you have an extremely coordinated bunch of electrical activity, basically. Some neurons are firing action potentials, some are not. And it's extremely coordinated, basically, which ones are firing action potentials and which ones are not. And that is obviously how we think that we have this extremely coordinated sequence of action potentials occurring within the brain. Okay? In a seizure, what happens is the electrical activity within the brain loses that incredibly coordinated nature, and instead it just becomes uncoordinated and haphazard, basically. Okay, and you end up with neurons firing action potentials in an incredibly haphazard way. So basically what ends up happening is loads of neurons end up firing action potentials all at once basically, and that's what is meant by this storm of electrical activity, and it's no longer got that incredible coordination that then allows computation or thought or things like that. Okay, so it's a breakdown of the coordinated nature of the electrical activity within the brain. Okay, right. So seizures come in two flavours. There are what are known as focal seizures, okay, and then there are also what's known as generalised seizures. Okay, right. So basically a focal seizure is where it's just a small portion of the brain in which this storm of electrical activity is actually occurring. So if I draw the brain here, okay, a focal seizure is a little portion of the brain actually undergoing this storm of electrical activity. So in a focal seizure, a little portion of the brain is going to have its neurons starting to fire action potentials all at once, basically, and that's what's known as a focal seizure. And generally it is in the temporal lobe that focal seizures occur. Okay, right. Meanwhile, a generalised seizure then is when it's occurring all over the brain. So basically, neurons all over the entire brain start firing action potentials all at once, and that is what is known as a generalised seizure. Okay, right. So before we define what epilepsy then is, let's go over what a convulsion is. Okay, right, or what convulsions are. Okay, so convulsions are involuntary movements, basically, okay? So movements that you are not in control of, basically, that you did not initiate, but nevertheless are occurring, okay? And again, convulsions can be either focal convulsions, or they can be generalised convulsions, and it's basically exactly the same principle as for the seizures. In focal convulsions, you get involuntary movements occurring in just a little portion of the body. Okay, so if I draw a little crude picture of the body here, in a focal convulsion you get a movement that's involuntary in a certain portion of the body, maybe just one limb of the body, like shown, whereas in a generalised convulsion, what you end up having is involuntary movements all over the body, basically. Okay? Right, so convulsions are incredibly related to seizures because what often happens in seizures is you end up getting involuntary activation of portions of the motor cortex, basically, and then the motor cortex sends out the instructions for movements that weren't voluntarily initiated, basically, and that's what then causes convulsions. So generally seizures lead to convulsions. However, there are numerous different types of seizures that then don't involve convulsions. So it's important to distinguish between seizures and convulsions, okay, because not all seizures will actually lead to convulsions. Usually convulsions do follow seizures, however. Okay, right. So now let me tell you about what epilepsy then is. Okay, so epilepsy is a condition in which you get recurrent seizures, basically. Okay, that's the key defining feature of epilepsy, recurrent seizures. Okay, now anyone can suffer a seizure, basically. If you raise blood glucose up to a really high level, you can initiate a seizure in anyone, basically. Okay, however, in epilepsy, what happens is you get seizures without having such physiological crises occurring, basically. Okay, so the seizures are initiated by something that's not as extreme as blood glucose going through the roof, basically. Okay, so that's what epilepsy is. It's recurrent seizures for some reason. Okay, and we'll see an example of how you can get recurrent seizures in this generalised epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. Okay, so coming back now to what happens in generalised epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. Okay, so basically I've said that this is going to be caused by germline mutation. Okay, but I said that there were different proteins that you could have germline mutations in, which would all cause generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. Okay, and we are specifically interested then in the cases of generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus, where it is a mutation in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit that is actually causing the generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. Okay, so we're now going to talk about then what sort of mutations can occur in this GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit. Okay, right. So basically, the gene for GABA A receptor gamma 2 is on an autosome. I don't know the exact number of the chromosome that it's present on, but it's an autosome. Now, what that means is that you have two copies of the gene, a maternal copy and a paternal copy. So if I just draw this, let's say this is one of your homologous chromosomes with a GABA A receptor gamma 2 gene on it, okay, and here's the other homologous chromosome. Okay, so now we'll just highlight up the genes for this protein. So these can represent the two genes, the maternal copy of the gene and the paternal copy of the gene. Okay, and both of those will be making GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunits. Okay, now, basically to get generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus, you only need to actually have a mutation in one of these, okay? So this is an autosomal dominant disease, okay? You don't need to have mutations in both of them. So, let me then give you an example of a mutation in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 gene which can lead to generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus if you have a copy of it in your germline. Okay, so basically, a example is K289M. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, in order to read this, you need to know how to read mutation lingo. Okay, so basically what this means is that the amino acid lysine at position 289 has been mutated to a methionine. So if I draw out a crude picture here of my GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit, basically usually there will be a lysine in this protein at position 289. Okay, however in this mutation, that lysine at position 289, okay, so K is the single letter amino acid code for lysine, okay, and M is the single letter code for methionine. So that lysine at position 289 has been changed to a methionine, basically. Okay, right. Now, where actually is lysine 289 as far as the structure of the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit is concerned? Well, it's actually in between the M2 and M3 alpha helices, okay? So in that extracellular loop between M2 and M3. Now you'll note that that's the portion that may well be in contact with our cis-loop and our beta-1, beta-2 loops, so those two loops that link the extracellular domain to the M2 helix, so that changes in the conformation of the extracellular domain can cause changes in conformation of the M2 helix. They may well contact that M2, M3 loop in order to be able to contact the M2 helix below it. Okay, so potentially this lysine mutating to a methionine may well disrupt those contacts. Okay, right. So basically this mutation does indeed lead to loss of function of the GABA A receptor gamma 2. However, it does still lead to the proteins that you produce here being incorporated into the pentamers. So you do in fact make GABA A receptor pentamers with this mutant GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit within them, basically. Okay? And now what happens basically is those GABA A receptor pentamers with this mutant gamma 2 subunit in them end up having much lower function, basically, okay? So when GABA binds to them, the amount of chloride anions they're actually going to let into the cell is going to be much, much smaller than a normal GABA A receptor pentamer would do, basically. And we don't fundamentally at the moment know exactly what it is that goes wrong, but we know that these GABA A receptor pentamers, which have this mutant gamma 2 in them, have a much lower function, basically. Okay, so their response to GABA, the amount of chloride anions they're actually going to let into the postsynaptic cell in response to GABA is going to go down. Okay, now what that means is that the function of your GABAergic system is going to be decreased, basically, okay, because now your GABA A receptors all over the brain are poisoned, basically, by many of them having this mutant gamma 2 within them, and those ones with the mutant gamma 2 in them are going to be functioning much lower, basically. Okay, so GABAergic neurotransmission is going to go down. So the amount of inhibition that you're getting onto neurons all over the brain is going down. Okay, now what does that mean? That means that it's going to be easier for neurons all over the brain to fire action potentials. Okay, so you can start to see maybe how this is putting you at risk of getting seizures, basically. Seizures, after all, are when neurons are overexcited, basically. They're firing too many action potentials. Okay, we have now got a germline mutation that is leading to it being easier for neurons to fire action potential. So you can start to see how this might give rise to you suffering from epilepsy, basically. Okay, right. So that's the link between this mutation in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit and then the actual seizures. Now what I want to describe to you is the actual seizures that occur in people with generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is meant by febrile seizures plus. Okay, and in order for me to tell you what is meant by febrile seizures plus, I first need to tell you about what actually is meant by a febrile seizure. Okay, so basically a febrile seizure is a seizure induced by overheating. Okay, so it's induced by body temperature being too high. Okay, so if heat goes up too high, if body temperature goes up too high, then that can induce a febrile seizure in people susceptible to having febrile seizures. It doesn't induce a febrile seizure normally in most people, not unless you take up the body temperature too high, of course. Okay, right, so what examples could lead to body temperature being raised by a tiny little bit? Okay, so for instance, if you have a fever then, okay, so if you have a fever, maybe because you have a viral infection, okay, then body temperature is raised in order to try and actually combat the infection. The idea is that the pathogen, whatever it is, might be less able to live in a higher ambient temperature, basically. Okay, so febrile seizures then are induced by the body overheating. Now generally they only occur in people between the ages of 6 months and 6 years. Okay, so usually only in children, basically. Okay, so 6 months to 6 years usually. However, now I can say what febrile seizures plus is. Okay, in febrile seizures plus, which I'll just denote as FS plus, they go on beyond 6 years. Okay, so in people with generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus, so for instance, a germline mutation in one of your GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunits, such as K289M, you will get febrile seizures going on in these people to beyond 6 years, basically. It can go on up to around 12 years of age, basically, in febrile seizures plus. Okay, so that's what's meant by febrile seizures plus. So that's one of the things that's going to occur in people with GEFS plus, basically. You're going to have these seizures in response to overheating of the core body temperature until you're around 12 years of age, potentially. Okay, right, so what then actually happens then in a febrile seizure? Okay, so initially what happens is that you lose consciousness and become very, very stiff, basically. Okay, so what does that mean? So I'll just jot some of this down. Lose consciousness, that's a key one, okay, and also the body becomes very, very stiff. So what does stiff body actually mean? Okay, well, basically, if you try and move someone's joints normally, okay, you try and move their joints passively, usually it won't be too difficult, basically. You can move the joints very, very easily, okay? Now, in someone who's very, very stiff, it will be really, really difficult to move their joints passively, basically, because muscle tone is far too high, okay? Muscles are always receiving a little bit of stimulation to contract, basically, and in people who are very stiff, the muscles are receiving too much tone, basically, and they're always contracting too much, basically. So in this initial portion of a febrile seizure, the body will become very stiff, muscle tone is going to be raised, basically. And that will mean that it's much more difficult to passively move the joints of these people. Okay, so that's one of the symptoms, stiffness. Okay, and then what starts to happen is the actual convulsions, basically. Now, they're not particularly dramatic convulsions in febrile seizures. Okay, so it's hardly flailing about. Okay, instead what you get is more little sort of twitching movements of the arms and legs. Okay, so little sort of twitching movements, involuntary twitching movements of the limbs. Okay, right, so it's not violent flailing about, though. Okay, and generally, febrile seizures last for about 5 minutes, basically, okay, before they then end. Okay, so, in people with generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus then, this is how it begins. Young in life, you're going to have febrile seizures, where you have these little seizures in response to your body temperature being too high, for instance, when you have a viral infection. Okay, now, unfortunately, as you get older, you get other forms of seizures occurring. Okay, seizures that don't require your core body temperature to be too high for them to actually occur. Okay, so one of the major forms of seizures that occurs in people with generalized epilepsy with febrile seizures plus as they get older is what's known as a tonic-clonic seizure. Okay, which is one of the major types of epileptic seizures, full stop. Okay, so let me just describe what happens in a tonic-clonic seizure. Okay, so it's actually quite similar to what happens in a febrile seizure, just a little bit more dramatic, basically, and also not induced anymore by too high body temperature. Okay, right, so the reason it's called a tonic-clonic seizure is that it can be divided up into 2 phases. Okay, there is the tonic phase, and in the tonic phase, again what happens is you lose consciousness and you become stiff. Okay, so that is why it's called the tonic phase, because muscle tone is going up, basically. Okay, stiffness and losing consciousness. Okay, then begins the clonic phase of the seizure. Okay, and in the clonic phase you start having convulsions, basically. Your muscles start relaxing and then contracting, relaxing, contracting, relaxing, contracting, rhythmically, basically. And this can end up very dramatic, okay? You can end up with full flailing movements, basically, of the arms and limbs. Okay, so in the clonic phase you will then get the convulsions. Okay, right. Now, in all, the tonic-clonic seizures generally last for around 3 minutes, okay? So 3 minutes in total. And after a tonic-clonic seizure, what generally happens is people end up going to sleep after they've had it, or they'll end up in a altered state of consciousness, basically. And this state that you're in for about half an hour after having a tonic-clonic seizure is called the postictal state. Okay, so after someone's stopped having the seizure, either they'll end up going to sleep, which is called postictal sleep, or they'll end up being awake, but they won't actually be with it, basically. You'll be able to talk to them, but they won't be able to respond, they won't really know who you are, okay? It's an altered level of consciousness, basically. And usually the postictal state goes on for about 30 minutes, or half an hour, after the actual tonic-clonic seizure. Okay, right. So that's a form of heritable epilepsy then that is caused by this generalized, caused by this germline mutation in the GABA A receptor gamma 2 subunit. Okay, the other thing that I should just say about tonic-clonic seizures is that after you've had a tonic-clonic seizure and after you've returned from the post-ictal state, so consciousness has returned to normal now, you generally won't remember having it, so you'll then have amnesia of the event, basically. Okay, right. So we'll call it there for this video, and in the next video what we'll move on to discussing is the glycine receptors and hyperekplexia.